Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
All right, I'm not sure if you got that at the beginning, but I'll go once more. Just welcome Trustee Taji Jones with Lancaster ISD School Board, also serving as the president of the Texas Caucus of Black School Board members. As our friends at Leadership ISD, MASBA, and the Texas Caucus, we have co-sponsored this event to provide you with some great details and great information that's going to really wow you today with these panelists. Before I go through all of that, I'd like to draw your attention to a few details concerning the GoToWebinar platform. If you'd like to pose a question, please utilize the question box located to the right side of your screen. You can pose this question to one panelist or all. Those will be read near the end. And now it is my pleasure to introduce the moderator of our panel. He serves trustees throughout the state of Texas as part of the Texas Association of School Boards, where he is Division Director of Board Development Services. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Phil Gore.
Thank you, Ty. It's wonderful to be with each of you again today. And we do have a very impressive panel and an important conversation here, obviously, to talk about. If you happen to catch this weekend, and I hope that most of you did, as part of a virtual graduation ceremony for historically Black colleges and universities, President Obama shared, "You're being asked to find your way in a world in the middle of a devastating pandemic and a terrible recession. The timing is not ideal. And let's be honest, a disease like this just spotlights the underlying inequities and extra burdens that Black communities have historically had to deal with in this country. We see it in the disproportionate impact of COVID-19 on our communities, just as we see it when a Black man goes for a jog and some folks feel they can stop and question and shoot him if he doesn't submit to their questioning." The former president went on to say, "Injustice like this is not new. What is new is that so much of your generation has woken up to the fact that the status quo needs fixing, that the old ways of doing things don't work, and that it doesn't matter how much money you make if everyone around you is hungry and sick. That our society and democracy only works when we think not just about ourselves, but about each other. We recognize the current pandemic is shining a bright light on the inequities within our country. These inequities highlight the different world that the rich and powerful live in than most of us. My own children have been unable to get testing both for COVID-19 and for the antibodies. At the same time, there is no limited tests available for the wealthy and for the politicians. The pandemic very sadly highlights disparities we have along racial lines. If you didn't already realize that, you probably didn't really have to look up. So we want to spend our time today not massaging the problem, but actually exploring and moving forward to solutions. Today we have a respected panel of experts that are going to talk with us about solutions for how we can improve access and outcomes for students of color. Let's focus on our time there. Many of you, but not all of you, know Mary Furtakis. I met Mary at a State School Boards Association conference in 2002. At the time, Mary and I were both school board members in King County, Washington. He is now an elected member of the Washington State Board of Education, as well as CEO of M. Furtakis Consulting, which focuses on equity and inclusion in the P-12 education system, and the intersection that has with housing, health, and well-being, workforce, transportation, and economic policy. Mary is a past president of the Washington School Directors Association, and she served for 22 years on the Tukwila School Board. While president of the Tukwila School Board a few years ago, the New York Times identified Mary's district as the most ethnically diverse in the nation. She has a Bachelor of Arts degrees in both political science and international studies, a master's in education policy from the University of Washington, an ELL teaching certification from Seattle University, and she served in the Peace Corps as a rural community development specialist in Senegal, West Africa. Before I ask Mary the first question, let me go ahead and introduce the rest of our panel. I met Kay Douglas at one of my first National School Board Trainers Conferences in Chicago in 2009. Kay is a senior consultant. She's a mediator and a trainer working for the Texas Association of School Boards. Prior to coming to TASB, she served for 16 years on the Huntsville ISD Board of Trustees, and she is a graduate of Leadership TASB. Kay received her Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Columbia and her law degree from the University of Houston. After working in the General Counsel's office of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, she was a prosecutor for 13 years in Walker County and trained prosecutors across the country. Cinto and I first met about 6 years ago at a TASB conference, but he really got my attention when I heard him speak at one of our summer leadership conferences 4 years ago in Fort Worth. Jacinto Ramos Jr. is a national, state, and community leader. He is a proven leader on educational policy, racial, ethnic equity, and school district governance. Jacinto is chair of the 2019-2020 Council of Urban Boards of Education, otherwise known as CUBE, as well as president of MASBA. He was born and raised on the north side of Fort Worth. Jacinto is a product of immigrant parents from Mexico, devoting countless hours to the cause of providing a voice to the disengaged and disenchanted youth of today. Bridging silos of activism, leadership, and community engagement, earned a spot on the Fort Worth ISD board in 2013. 2 years later, he reached an historic precedent and became the youngest board president in Fort Worth ISD. In addition to his leadership roles in CUBE and MASBA, he's also now one of the 22 school board members on the NSBA board. And last but not least, Angela and I have had the pleasure of knowing each other for about 3 years. Angela is the Executive Director of Teaching and Learning in Grand Prairie ISD. She believes strong public schools serve as the foundation of our democracy, sustain strength to our economy, and provide the key to unlock endless opportunities for all students. She is looking forward to seeing how her research will guide board practices across Texas. Angela is a proud graduate of the inaugural cohort of the Holdsworth Center's District Leadership Program. She's also a recipient of one of TASB's great scholarships, which encourages research on how governance affects student achievement in Texas. Angela's research explores board presidents' perceptions of their board's practices of good governance, and she's nearly complete with her study, and it will be available to all of us by the end of the summer. Mary, I want to go back in light of what President Obama was saying. Our society and democracy only work when we think not just about ourselves, but about each other. Tell us about what you did this week.
Thank you, Phil, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be with this group. That was an amazing speech that President Obama gave, and he just nailed a lot of key points. But I had told Phil what happened this weekend, and we felt that it fit in with what we were trying to talk about today. Yesterday, in 10 days' time, we had a group of the foundation that I started and a coalition of folks who put together Iftar food baskets, food ingredients for the Muslim families in our two communities. And we were able to provide these ingredients for 450 families. And again, we organized this in about 10 days, and it's a direct result of the COVID-19 issue. We know that this has impacted so many communities with a lot of different issues, food being one of them. And we're in Ramadan right now, which is an expensive month for people to be practicing with their traditional and cultural recipes, and the fact they can't get together, and a lot of different things. And we got funding to do this from the Seattle Foundation, but what I need to share is we only got that funding because we fought. They did a distribution of $10.1 million several weeks ago to 125 organizations in King County, and my community and my adjacent community got $0. And we are two of the most disproportionately impacted communities in this crisis. And it was just another example of being invisible. And that when you're predominantly communities of color, when you're predominantly in poverty, you get overlooked. And we said, we're done with this. And we put a coalition together, wrote a 3-page letter to the president of the foundation and to our King County executive, and not only expressed what our concerns were, but offered solutions. So the funding that we received was a recognition of the fact that they messed this up. And I think this is a good example of what we're seeing in a crisis where expediency is being put above process, and they used no kind of racial equity lens. They didn't use their data, and that's how communities like ours get overlooked. And I know we're seeing this across the country, but as a result of that pushing back, my Somali sister and I and our organizations were able to put together this incredible event. And we had 72 volunteers. I had to turn people away to help, and we were able to get all of these food items out in an hour and a half to feed 450 families in our 2 communities.
Wow.
I'm so grateful to have Mary with us, because truly she is a consummate example of what President Obama was talking about our democracy only works when we think not just about ourselves, but about others. And Mary, from her early 20s on, has been really dedicated her whole life to serving people that don't look like her. And very, very impressive legacy. I can't let her go on because she could go for hours from Peace Corps up until today. But wanting to give everyone a chance to speak here, we did have a slide on crisis that some of you have seen before, but it wasn't a few years ago when that was brought up, 10 or 15, maybe 20 years ago, it wasn't really being portrayed accurately. Mary, would you talk just for a minute about that Chinese symbol for crisis and what it truly means?
Sure. Is Jamie going to be putting that up for people to see?
He was trying, but I'm not seeing it.
Okay, so this is it's a really powerful analogy of what we're going through right now. And the word for crisis in Chinese characters, it's 2 characters. The first one signifies danger. And yes, when you're in some type of a crisis, there are dangerous elements. But the other piece of it is that it's also called it stands for incipient moment, or a moment in time where things can change. And I thought that was a really powerful way to express what is going on right now. Yes, we've got a lot of danger, we've got a lot of things happening, but we've never had an opportunity like this in any of our lifetimes to actually be able to impact systems the way this type of pandemic allows us to imagine and to think through. And there are things that we can talk about now that I know personally I would have been laughed out of the room 3 months ago for bringing them up. And now people are saying, yeah, let's have a conversation about that. So we're at that incipient moment, and it seemed like a good way to frame this conversation around the what if we can accomplish for our students.
That's awesome. Kay, like Mary, I know you to be a consummate advocate for others. Specifically, what steps can school boards as well as individual trustees take to learn from inequities exposed by the pandemic and focus on improvements to access and outcomes for students of color in Texas?
I think the first thing they can do is name it. We are all very familiar with the conversation. We feel comfortable having the conversation with each other, but there are lots of boards that don't have these conversations, either because they think they don't exist in their district or because they have so few people who fall into a particular demographic that they're often overlooked. But the first thing is absolutely talk about it. And they've navigated the technology to be able to meet remotely, so they can still have conversations, but it also takes a lot of courage to be able to actually have those conversations. And we've been talking on this series of webinars for weeks about there's some things that very cohesive boards can do and do well, and then there's some boards that were challenged before this, and how do they do that better? But the first thing is to have the conversation. The second thing, now that we have navigated this school year and we're planning for how we're going to be able to continue, I think a couple of things. First of all, we don't know when this is going to end. People are starting to reopen, but we don't really know when it's going to end. We don't know how it's going to end. We don't actually even know if we're going to be here when it ends, let's be frank. So having those conversations, but I think that when those conversations, I think we would all agree that they've got to have as many voices as they can. Just like Mary said, if you don't fight for the funding, you're not going to have it. If you don't bring people to the table that you didn't have there before, if you're not listening to people who are homeless, and there are going to be more people who are homeless because of this pandemic, if we're not listening to students, they need to be able to tell us what they need, and we've got to listen to staff, because I think the most important thing when and if we reopen is, how are we going to keep people safe? Is our staff going to feel safe enough to come back? Are our students going to feel safe enough to come back? The Ohio State Board is involving parents in their decisions. They're asking them 3 questions. What questions do you have? Are you willing to send your child back when school reopens? And are you willing to send your child back if we require masks? So how do we involve people of color? How do we involve parents of color? How do we involve parents of special ed children? How do we involve our teaching staff, which a large part of the teaching demographic is in one of the protected one. They may be immunocompromised. So let's not have conversations at the table without having all the voices there.
That's great. Yeah, so some key takeaways, first steps. One, naming it, recognizing, hello, we have a problem, but then really critical to ensure that all voices are at the table, the decision-making table. Jacinto, we appreciate your powerful voice that you bring to school and the leadership that you provide in our state and nation. What are you learning and thinking about differently in light of this pandemic, and what improvements to access and outcomes are you envisioning for Fort Worth ISD, for Texas Public Schools, and for the U.S.?
Well, good morning, good afternoon, Phil and everyone. I think first and foremost, what's really come to mind is, and I'll speak for what's true for me. I always encourage I statements versus blank generalized statements. And so what's true for me is that I know I can no longer kick the can down the road. Sitting there thinking that maybe I have more time, that I have time to address the inequities revolving around access to technology, social emotional needs, just the basic of things that I already knew young people and families were probably needing. I think now I've realized that sitting there thinking we have more time, that I have more time, is not my reality. That my mindset had to shift once this began to happen, and had to move into overdrive to be able to address that. So I think that what's true for Fort Worth is we're thinking differently. We don't have a choice. So part of that thinking differently includes looking at internet connectivity as a vital utility, similar as we look at water and electricity and gas. Technology is in access to internet access. It's a conduit of empowerment for our school districts, and it's something that's going to make sure that all of our children are able to get that basic access to learning. We're considering a calendar that moves beyond the traditional cycle of the 19th and 20th century, right? So it's what makes sense for the future is that for Fort Worth, we're going to have a huge survey that's going to go out to all of our stakeholders this week, and where we want to gauge their interest in an intersession calendar that plays to our strengths and not to the past. So, taking that into consideration, we'll also want to remember that if we move to an intersession calendar, that we will need to engage the entire community and not just those that have traditionally shown up. And what that looks like would be very, very different. I come from a street level mindset as a former gang interventionist, as a juvenile probation officer, that I was accustomed to being in people's homes and hearing it directly from them. I am envisioning Fort Worth ISD to be much of the same way. That doesn't necessarily have to be our teachers or educators, which some are already doing that. And I think they're seeing dividends for that, as being careful and as cautious as they can be, right? And that means just even the phone calls and the texts that maybe they weren't accustomed to. And I also think about a teacher that was highlighted here in DFW for her innovative way of using Facebook to engage her elementary school students. So things that probably, not to be offensive, but to speak my truth, is things that go against the grain, things that go against whiteness, things that have been long overdue in our school systems, things that, let's just be real, that charter school systems and private school systems have been doing, that have put those kinds of barriers to the side. I think in Fort Worth ISD, we're about to do that. So engaging those voices is huge. And then, for us is an ongoing conversation, as Kay and Mary have already mentioned, is going to be that funding and that building of power and coalition so that public school education doesn't get pushed to the wayside.
Jacinto, it's great to hear that emphasis on true community engagement. Not just an exercise. Engaging all the groups. I can only hope the echo. Panelists have already heard my attempts at singing to make a round here with the echo. Part of that constituent or community group that Kay emphasized just moments ago was staff. And one of the reasons we wanted Angela in this conversation, not only is she doing research on school boards and looking at that very intensely here in Texas through the University of North Texas there in Denton, but she also brings the background and perspective as a school administrator. And so, Angela, I'm very curious what perspectives that you see from what you see happening around the state of Texas. How are school districts addressing access gaps for internet connectivity and devices, perhaps in your district or other districts?
Well, first, good afternoon, and thank you so much for this opportunity to share this afternoon. In Grand Prairie ISD, I have to say we were very fortunate because 4 years ago, our board approved one-to-one devices for our students in grades 3 through 12. And with that approval, also we knew the device wasn't just going to be the source, but we needed to train our teachers, our administrators, how to use those devices so that we really could transform the way that we were providing instruction to our students. Also, we wanted to also monitor how our students, our parents were engaging with that technology. So we partnered with Bright Bites. And so I say all that really to provide context to what happened when COVID hit. So when COVID hit, I have to say we had the devices, our teachers and students were prepared, but what we also knew through our Bright Bright survey was that 20% of our student population did not have access to Wi-Fi in their homes. And so our immediate plan was to figure out who that 20% was and how were we going to address it. So like many districts, we decided to keep our Wi-Fi access open on our campuses. So parents, if they decided to go to the campus and maybe stay in their cars, they could, not inside the building, but in their cars, they would have Wi-Fi access. We partnered with digital providers so that they had reduced rates and promoted those on our websites. But the other thing that we did is we started having conversations with businesses to see how our students could get that Wi-Fi access. But while we were doing all of this research, we did not want those students who did not have Wi-Fi access to lose the opportunity to learn and engage and have access to the curriculum. So we partnered all across the district with our teachers to have paper packets, and our teachers had to be innovative in the way that they were engaging with students. So they had to make phone calls. So even though I would say we were intentional before COVID, we had to stretch our intentionality in making sure that our students were still learning. When I think about what districts are doing across the state, I really think it's important to give kudos to Lockhart ISD. They've done something that very few districts have been able to do. They actually purchased cell towers to provide access, Wi-Fi access to all teachers and to all students, which I think is critical because what COVID unveiled to me personally is not only does not having Wi-Fi access not allow students access to a digital, innovative 21st century curriculum, but really I started thinking about, wow, if a family does not have Wi-Fi access, then how can that mother, that father apply for a job when those applications are all online? How can they have access to their doctor when I know my appointment on Friday is a virtual appointment? So now we're talking about not having access to health care. And so it's a systemic denial of opportunities that are really much larger than the educational perspective. And so what I'm hoping this COVID season will do is allow us to engage in those conversations and then provide ways to provide Wi-Fi access. And it's like what Cinto said, you know, it's just like providing water, it's just like providing electricity. It is a central need in our communities for us to survive.
Well, that's actually, you know, really heavy to think about as you mentioned people trying to apply for a job and all that's done online. Healthcare is now being provided online. Certainly unemployment benefits and those kind of things are all online. And we do know that across our state, there are pockets and large percentages of folks who don't have adequate devices or internet access, both. So I'm really curious, Angela, I don't know if you can do this or not, but with your dissertation not quite done, can you give us a teaser of what you were seeing here just recently, because this is so fresh? What were you seeing across Texas as maybe just opportunities for improvement in school governance?
Dr. Gore, you know, a lot of people say that the dissertation process is a tedious process and it's grueling, and it is, but I love this process. I enjoyed researching school boards, and it was just the joy that I didn't know I was missing in my life. When I think about the interviews, the surveys, as well as the school board observations that I perform, one question in particular really speaks to what we're dealing with now. And it's the question that I asked to several school board presidents, which is, can you give me an example of a policy that directly speaks to student achievement? And over half of the school board presidents that I spoke with talked about a policy that was centered on equity. They talked about how without addressing the needs and closing the gaps, there was no way that they could move the overall needle of the entire district. They talked about having that equity policy allowed them to unapologetically and to freely discuss those opportunity gaps, those achievement gaps, without feeling uncomfortable in any kind of way. And it really helped focus and guide the work that they're doing. So make sure that they had the available and sustained resources, that they had a shared belief in where the district was going, and that they had a high expectation for all students. So whenever which I hope is before the summer, whenever I'm able to finally share my dissertation, I really hope that the people reading the part about equity really kind of changes the way governance is done, and people really will consider implementing an equity policy in their school district.
Well, that brings up an excellent topic that I know some of the other panelists have some strong feelings about and a lot of deeper thinking about as well. Very curious for Kay, Mary, or Cinto, what are some essential elements that should be considered in a local equity policy?
I'll pop in here. First of all, it can't be a boilerplate or a template that you're just checking a box to do. It takes a lot of local work because it needs to be reflective of your local context. And so I would just encourage people, you know, definitely look at examples. There's more and more examples from across the country. We've done some significant work in Washington State on developing a process for school boards to be creating their own race and equity policies. But even the title of your policy is important and is reflective of the kind of work that you're doing locally, because I've seen quite a range of them. But there is no way to get around the amount of work that's involved in this, and the conversations are an absolutely critical piece of developing what would eventually be your policy. And thank you for that research, Angela. I'm looking forward to reading your dissertation.
So I hear you saying, Mary, it's not about simply checking a box or filling out a form or having somebody create an equity policy for you and sending it by email and you saying yes. What else about that, Kay or Cinto, should go into creating an equity policy that really makes a difference for kids?
So I'll speak for what we experienced in Fort Worth is first and foremost, it has to come from the community input. Young people, educators, parents, guardians ought to be at the front end of this work. And the way we did that is we just put the data out there in front of them. And so the data speaks for itself. And it sends a resounding message, because then the stakeholders who we say we're here to serve will look back at us and say, so what have you been doing? If you know that the data has been on this trend, then what on earth are you doing here at these meetings and policy and budget? So I think first and foremost, it's got to come with the community input and true engagement. I think the other part is that once the later part of it is once the policy is done, it ought to be connected to the superintendent's evaluation. And so if achievement gaps aren't being closed, if student outcomes are being improved, then as Angela's talking about, then the policy just isn't working, or the variables aren't there. So if a superintendent is clear that the evaluation is based on that work, and I think if it's a governance model, it's tied into the goals, it's tied into the constraints, but that will minimize confusion as to what the board as a whole is prioritizing. And if the board is directly connected to the community, then everything is in sync, in my opinion. Now, it's not easy because the blowback is to come, especially internally, right? So when folks get to actually isolating race or having those, what we call those courageous conversations, there's a whole nother level to that as well.
I really agree with that sentiment there, Cinto, that if the board is saying this is what's important to us and giving that direction to their one employee, then he or she should be evaluated at least a major part of their performance on this is what the board has said was important. This is what we want you to do. Hey, would you like to add anything to that?
The only thing I'd add to that is, yes, it's important to have the policy. And as Mary said, and Cinto said, it takes work. But once you have the policy, how do you implement it? How do you implement it in student discipline? How do you implement it in dress code? How do you implement it in how you are assigning teachers? How do you implement it? There's so many things that come after that is absolutely the beginning, not even close to the end. And throughout that process, because so many times we listen to the voices at the outset, and we do that process, and then we put the policy out there, and then we just kind of tell them how we're going to do it. There has to be constant two-way feedback, constant. And we're really good at one-way feedback, but we really have to get the trust of the community to where they're going to tell us how things implement. But if I honestly don't think you're actually going to do anything, I'm less likely to engage. So how do we keep that conversation going? How do we? One of the things I learned recently is that Chicago Public Schools has a student voice committee at every single school. And they get together every 9 weeks to kind of figure out what are we hearing collectively. So when I know that this is not my one opportunity as a community member to speak, or it's not my one opportunity as a student to be heard, you develop those relationships that actually give you the input that you need. So it's not, are we practicing what we preached? Are we following the policy we put in?
Anyone want to add one more thought on policy, and particularly how to implement policy, how to monitor for its effectiveness?
One thing I would say is that I agree with everything that's been said, and the implementation is where the rubber hits the road on this. And so as a board member, are you allocating budget dollars to support this work? Do you actually have a budget line item that is for race and equity work? Because it comes down to the money, and we fund what is important to us, and we prioritize what's funded.
That's good. That's good. That's kind of where we want to go now for next steps. And I'll ask this of Cinto, but the rest of y'all can certainly jump in here. Just thinking about where we go from here. So we're in agreement. So we're in agreement. An policy. And there should be alignment in budgeting. Cinto, what 2 to 3 priorities do you wish that every school board and every Texas trustee would adopt in addition to an equity policy?
So I think first and foremost, it's adjusting the budget to what the most basic needs are to get our young people as close as we possibly can to the level playing field. And I acknowledge that that's going to look different for everyone. Even us being next to Dallas and Arlington and the other cities, that's going to vary. So for Forward ISD, that begins with one, listening to our stakeholders. And so we've got like a parent hotline. We're responding to every phone call we get. We're looking really to be transparent and to build trust. I think we felt that first and foremost with the graduation. When we made the announcement we were going to do this online, the board got some severe blowback from the community. And as a colleague of mine in Dallas said, we don't want to take a triumph of a graduation and turn it into a tragedy by making a decision to put a lot of people in one setting that may increase the numbers and get a lot of people sick. I think the most dominating conversation I've had with trustees and board presidents across the state and the country has been that fear. We have been given this power to make decisions, and we don't want to make one that's going to cost lives. But then there's another side to that of what that blowback is from the community who wants something here and there. So really, again, just to go back to the first point, is meeting those basic needs. For us, it's been technology, it's been food. I think the other one that I want to bring to the forefront is the mental health aspect. We talk a lot about the social emotional needs, and then this time right here, right now, all I'm hearing is from my colleagues that are in the juvenile justice world, that are in the counseling and therapy world, and what extreme needs we recognize that we have. So I don't think we can underestimate that. And I think that even goes for ourselves as trustees and superintendents that are in the line of fire right now of doing this work. I was just telling you all before we went live, I purposefully implemented some mental health breaks in my day because of my exhaustion from being on Zoom calls and phone calls. And, when I used to have a break to drive from one place to another, that's no longer something that I've made a priority. So I think those are important. And then I think the one that sticks to governance is that we all ought to be revisiting our goals, our strategic plans, because the game has changed. And so I think about the lines that one of my mentors gave me. He said, "You can't teach what you don't know, and you can't lead where you don't go." Well, I think all of us are going somewhere where no one's ever really been before. Case studies will be written, research will be done, and in our situation, we'll be able to look back and see, did we prioritize the right things for our communities? Did we meet their basic needs? Did we keep their sanity and their mental health in mind? And did they feel loved and appreciated and connected by the big school system that we realize we're so dependent on? And so for that, I think for us, that self-care piece, the community, the budget, I think all of those go hand in hand.
Thank you so much, Cinto, for bringing up the subject of mental health. Sadly, it's something in our country that we have tended to avoid talking about and having courageous conversations about. And it's something that affects all of us, but it affects all of us in different ways. Very curious from any of the panelists, and I know Kay's got a lot of ideas. What can we do to take care of ourselves so that we're able to be of use and of value to other people? How do we take care of our mental health, especially during this time?
I think that's going to differ for each one of us. And first of all, just recognizing that it's okay to not be okay. Because every time somebody asks us, "How you doing?" "Oh, we're fine, great, it's perfect, couldn't get any better." And when you hear enough people say that, you don't want to say, "Oh my God, my life is falling apart. I was, on the ledge yesterday." And again, being able to name it and making it okay. Because if I told you I had a physical illness, you'd say, "Oh, go to the doctor, do something, do whatever they say." If I tell you I have something mentally going on, we kind of go, "Ooh, yeah, I thought she was tougher than that." So just giving ourselves the grace to not feel okay, and being able to share that with somebody, and giving other people the grace. And I'm so glad Cinto brought up SEL and mental health, because that's one of the things we have to consider in how we go back. You know, there are going to be folks. I am on day 65. My children literally will not let me leave my house because they think I'm going to perish and I'm their only parent. So they bring me food. They do all of the things that I could possibly need. I'm on day 65. I happen to be an introvert, so I'm actually in hermit heaven, but don't tell anybody. But there are people who need to get out. I have a sister who is as immunocompromised as anybody could get. She literally died 18 months ago and came back to life. She has to get out of the house. She said, I needed toilet paper. She probably got a closet full. So recognizing that this is affecting all of us differently, and however it's affecting you is okay. I have the privilege to be able to stay and work from home. Everybody doesn't have that. I have a daughter who works for the prison system who is on the front lines working 14, 15 days in a row without a day off. So I got to be a teacher at home for my grandson, which is another one of my fantasies. But realizing that everybody is doing this differently. If I had to teach 5 kids at home, 5 different grade levels, 5 different Zoom calls, 5 different packets, I'd go nuts. So understanding that this is different for everybody and however you're dealing with it is okay. You know, I've been cooking like a crazy woman. That's my therapy. What is your therapy and how do you get more of it? I know, Phil, if you had to stay in the house and couldn't run or couldn't walk or couldn't get outside, you'd be climbing the walls too. So we're all different, but recognizing, giving everybody the grace to say, this was a bad day. And we also have kids who are losing teachers, who are losing parents. People literally are dying. So how do we help people? How do we tell them it's okay to cry, to be sad, to reach out, to do the teletherapy? Okay, I'm done. I'm sorry.
That's good. Angela, I'd love to turn it to you. Something people can do either to take care of themselves or bringing that right into this issue of equity and ensuring that our students and staff are cared for. Like, make some connections for us.
Well, part of what I've learned through leadership is it's really about people, and that an organization is really built upon the people that's leading. That's like the greatest resource. And so when I think about my leadership, I really try to instill in the people that I have the privilege of leading, taking care of themselves, that it's okay to stop. It's everything that Kay just talked about. When you have back-to-back Zoom meetings, it's okay to have a stop time to go and take a walk around the block and then come back, because a lot of people are just trying to perform their best. They're trying to be everything to everybody, and you really can't unless you're taking care of yourself. So I think as leaders, it's important to really take care of the people that you're leading, make sure that you're giving them permission to stop and giving them permission to say it's not okay, and to encourage them to say, you know what, it can get better, and give them grace to do the best that they can.
Nice.
May I add something? Because I'm sitting here nodding. Kay and I just track on so many things and what we think is important. And I heard a really great analogy that I wanted to share related to this, because we all are experiencing this differently. And people have tried to say things like, we're all in this together. We're not. Everybody is experiencing this differently. And the analogy that I've liked is that we may all be in the same storm, but we're not in the same boat. If you're in a battleship, you're barely feeling the waves coming up against you. But if you're in a rowboat, it's a completely different experience. And that's what's happening in our historically marginalized communities. We know what the disparities are and who is contracting and dying from COVID-19. All of our systems, we are seeing the inequities in our faces, and it's a good thing, because it's making it tough for us to pivot away from this, as we have for far too long. But to be able to give people that gracious space is a really powerful tool too. And it's happened on several groups that I'm on when we're having our Zoom meetings, is we're literally taking a big chunk of the meeting to just let everyone go through, and we call it gracious space. Just say, how are you doing? And it's been very powerful. And it took about 45 minutes on one meeting I was on, but it was a very cathartic thing to be able to get it out there and see that while we were all experiencing our own storms, and that it was okay to express that. And it was, then we could actually focus on the meeting, because that's the other part of this. If you're carrying that burden, our brains react. We have a physiological reaction to crisis and stress and trauma, which so many people are experiencing now, and it's impossible to learn. I'm on our state work group for social emotional learning in Washington State, and that's been the conversation, is that when we come back together in school, whatever that looks like, before any kind of academics are taking place, we're going to have to address the social emotional learning aspect of what both our students and our staff are coming back with.
That's great. I mean, this is the heart of things. This is where the rubber meets the road, as they used to say. How do we move from here? How do we transition? And how we do that is what we do differently is going to say an awful lot about us as a society. The commissioner has started to talk about something that is very near and dear to Kay's heart. And I know Cinto mentioned this already with the shift in the calendar, but others could jump in here, and Kay, particularly on the calendar issue. Why is this so important? Why do we need a different calendar instead of the 18th century agrarian calendar for the way we do school? Don't all students need 2 or 3 months off in the summer?
No. And how long do you have? Because you know this is my signature scream. The agrarian calendar. I've never had a child or grandchild who picked any crop. So it was all based on, we need to bring in the crops. My kids don't bring in crops. But more importantly, just like we're experiencing now, this is summer slide on steroids. When school is closed, there are kids that aren't eating. When kids are closed, when schools are closed, there are kids that are being abused, and nobody's got eyes on that kid like they would in school. Students with disabilities who had a routine, who had a set curriculum of people who were involved in their lives are now at home, and they don't have that. You know, students who are English language learners have had months where they're not exercising those skills. So there is no upside for that 3 months. Even kids who don't necessarily lose reading skills lose math skills. And during that time, there are kids who are in homes that don't have books and don't have the resources that we've talked about. And then there are kids there were kids that were going to museums and programs, and now all of the online things are kicking in. So during that 2 months, the gap was getting bigger and bigger. So I cannot even imagine what the gap will be back after, when and if we ever come back. So what the actual research is that gap hurts everybody. And we're talking about spreading out the calendar, not even necessarily more days, just giving longer breaks, which gave teachers and students a chance to refresh. It gave children who were behind a chance to have maybe some remediation instead of waiting an entire year to give them remediation. But what's interesting is TEA has actually put out some possibilities, and I put it on my Facebook page, and people are already saying, oh no, we can't go back early, we can't stay longer, we can't do it differently. But we are doing it differently. You know, we thought this was a huge ship that we couldn't turn around, and then literally within days and weeks, we turned an entire ship. We did it differently. So I hope we will take this time to say normal wasn't working, normal isn't coming back. So what do we do from what we learned? How do we put that to use for kids, for teachers, for the entire community? Because I live in a community that did balanced calendar when my daughter was in school, and she's 32. So 20 years ago. So it's not as though we haven't done it, and it's not as though there aren't districts that are still doing it, but how do we make that decision for each individual school district? I don't want to mandate anything. I don't want it to be one size fits all, but I want every board to say, will this work for us? What portion of it will work? Ask the community and see. I'm done. I'm sorry.
That's great. That's good. That's good. You kept that to 3 minutes.
Oh, yeah.
Angela, expound on that. I mean, out of this crisis, what are we seeing differently, that there's this opportunity, if you will, for improvement, something to start, to stop, to do better?
Like Kay and Cinto, we're excited about the possibility of this extended year calendar, because what it really will do is provide an opportunity to address those achievement gaps, no matter what they may be. So students who may need help with reading, we can have targeted programs or instruction geared just for those students, or maybe in high school, we want to improve our college readiness and making sure our students are prepared for the TSI. So it's really an opportunity to be extremely intentional about closing those gaps for our students so that they can be successful moving forward.
I'm not seeing questions coming in from the audience, and I don't know if there's another person on the call that may be able to see those and read them, but this would be an opportunity. We've got about 9 minutes officially left. If you have a question, please add that in on the column under questions near the chat box, and we'll get to that if possible. Cinto, out of this pandemic, is there something else that perhaps now that some light's being shown on problems, on inequities, something else we could either stop or continue or do differently?
Yeah, thanks for asking. I guess here to go off of what Kay had said also, it's okay to say you're not okay. In my role at Leadership ISD, we have begun phone calls between board members, board presidents. We've even been talking to folks outside of Texas to see what others are doing. So that's to say that if it's okay not to have the answers in an unprecedented time. And I think that just models great leadership when we say we just don't know. What I think it does is it presents an opportunity for each and every one of us to reach out to others who are in similar situations. And so through Leadership ISD, the phone calls we started the week after all of this happened was really just for my own well-being and my own sanity, where I reached out and said, look, I have no idea what's happening and which way we should go. And I don't want this to be a competitive thing. I just want this to be more of a collaborative thing, because if my children are hurting, I know your children are hurting. And we can figure this thing out together sooner rather than later. I know that we'll all be able to celebrate something bigger and better in the midst of a challenging situation. So establishing a network, reaching out to a network, and getting that support. I think even because of the conversations of the inequities that have risen to the top, it puts us in a position where those of us who've been able to be on the forefront of this, even when it wasn't popular and it was frowned upon and people were walking out of workshops saying, I'm uncomfortable, I don't like what you're saying. That also came from a place of knowing that this was the reality. And so for my colleagues and friends who have been in the fight, been in the struggle way before it was cool, kudos to you. And there's still a heck of a lot more work to be done. So, no rest for the conversations of equity, and no rest for anyone who's feeling like we don't know what we're doing. We signed up for a job to say that we were leaders of our communities. And in that leadership role that we have been tasked with, we have now been tasked with one of the most trying times that any of our colleagues before us have had to deal with. So really would just offer that, make sure that we all stay connected.
We did get a question from the audience. Let me make sure we get this in here, and then we'll go to Mary as we end. With the largest percentage of our students coming from a Mexican American background, Latino, Latina, can anybody talk about improvements in being able to provide various services in Spanish for students or their families? The question specifically was about, I think, abuse reporting, but the opportunity for someone to be able to have their needs met in perhaps a native language or one that is stronger for them. Any ideas? Any ideas?
Yeah, I think for what's true for us, or for me, in my perspective in Fort Worth, is I am so grateful that we have the resources here locally. Not all of them, right? Because we've still got a lot of gaps. And we do have a significant amount. So we have the Northside Intercommunity Agency. We have Waves of Hope. There's a church locally. And we've got faith-based partners in our town that have been doing this work. So I think for those of us that are privileged to have those, then it's also probably important to note that this is probably a time that they're pretty overwhelmed. So those that are funders and donors have opportunities to be able to help fill those gaps. My concern obviously is with our undocumented population who have little to no access, who are frowned upon during this time. And so I think that's where those partnerships that we were referencing earlier are key. You know, Forward ISD, we have a strong My Brother's Keeper chapter program. And so we've got folks that are in the streets. You know, they steady stay in the streets. And so what I learned at the juvenile department as a community organizer was that our community is our greatest asset. And people have been taking care of each other for decades and generations. And I think to tap into that space of acknowledging that communities are so powerful, that there are resources within there, I think that's that gap for some districts. I don't want to assume again all. I think that's that gap in an opportunity for school districts to lean into that work, to see who those champions are. We have the Con Mi Madres, we have Hispanic Women's Network. I mean, we've got so many resources, and still I don't think it's enough. But for those that don't have any of that, I think that presents those opportunities for those conversations to take place.
Thank you for that, Cinto. Mary, I know you've been thinking deeply about issues of equity for decades. What has been said here or not said that you would like to take an opportunity to expound on, or to give support for encouraging more equitable outcomes and access here in Texas?
Thank you, Phil. And this has been I've been so appreciative of being able to be a part of this. I've been snapping my fingers down here. You can't see me on so many of the comments that were made. But one of the things that I'm seeing, and I'll use my own, where I live as an example, this whole thing is a matter of will and not resources. We have the resources, and what we prioritize is what happens. And where I live, in Washington, we had the first diagnosed case of COVID-19 in the country, and we had the first death, which took place about 30 minutes from me in my county. And I'm going to be honest here, when I heard that someone had died in the county, my first thought was, dear God, please let it be on the east side of the county, which is the affluent side of the county. Because if it happens there, then this is going to get some attention. If it happens in my part of the county, I don't know when people are going to pay attention to it. I'm just being honest, because the institutionally racist structures that we're all living in, we know that that's what happens. And it just so happened that it did take place on the east side of the county. And I saw in a matter of days, things happen that public officials were wringing their hands over for years. Oh, we don't have the resources to provide housing for homeless people. Well, they managed to buy a motel and start converting it within about, just a few days. And where did they put it? Down in my part of the county, not where the deaths were happening, from the nursing home in the east part of the county. So again, this is a matter of will and what we prioritize, and we have the resources to do the things that we say are important to us. So I would encourage you to be fighting that fight and raising those issues when we can see that the approach is inequitable. The other thing I would encourage all of us is to work across sectors. As Phil said at the beginning, I'm all about the intersectionality, because our institutionally racist structures are all of them. And so if we want to see high-speed internet access as a public utility, there are folks up here who are working with our Department of Commerce to do just that. Who do we need to be working with? Who do we need to bring to the table? Are we working with our Health and Human Service folks to help give the support and additional funding for the social emotional learning and the mental health pieces? So I would encourage us as education leaders, because we see all of this. A big thing, keeping our families housed. We don't want them to go into that cycle of homelessness and all of the other issues that raises. What are we doing to bring the sectors together to ensure that our families are staying housed during this time? So I would encourage education leaders who are sitting at that intersection of all of those other systems impacting students and families to be having the conversation now about what we can do to envision this going forward. And again, this is an unprecedented opportunity to really be addressing some of the things that we know have happened and have been happening for years.
Thank you very much, Mary, and thank you to each of you, to Kay, to Angela, to Jacinto. Thank you to those that have listened in. We appreciate that MASBA, the Black Caucus of School Board Members, and Texas ISD, Leadership ISD, excuse me, have been putting on these webinars every Monday since we started our shelter at home practices. They are taking next week off because of Memorial Day, but tune back in here in a couple of weeks and you should be on the list to get those invitations. Also, there are multiple other webinars that are available throughout the week. We've got a couple of valuable ones this year that this week TASB is doing on Thursday, one on personnel issues and then one with the commissioner that will be very valuable. But lots of other great things have been happening across our state to bring people together, and especially school board members and administrators for conversations. So thank you to each one of you for being a part of that. I know our webinars officially ended at some point here, but there was one question and I couldn't see it well enough. It's very, very long, and it's asking about data and essentially where when we come back in the fall to the next session of school, and whether that's in person or it's a little different than what we've been accustomed to, I think that the takeaway from the question is we need to be identifying and finding ways to look at systemic data to know precisely how our students are doing and not just guessing. But thank you again to all of you, and we wish everyone the best. Thank you.
Wakanda forever.